Paul Hendrickson on his biography of former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and 4 other Americans who helped define our Vietnam experience.
Hello, I'm Charles Dukes. I'm standing in for the vacationing Lisa Page. Tonight we welcome Paul Hendrickson, Washington Post staff writer, to Writer's Block. Paul is the author of Seminary, and also he's penned Looking for the Light, The Hidden Life of Marion Post Wolcott, the Depression-era photographer. He's with us tonight to discuss his acclaimed and popular treatment of the Vietnam era, The Living and the Dead, Robert McNamara, and 5 Lies of a Lost War. It's earned Paul a National Book Award nomination. The Living and the Dead was published a year after McNamara's own book, In Retrospect, but it presents a very different picture of the former Secretary of Defense and his actions and their consequences. Thanks for joining us in the coffee house. Good evening, Paul.
Hi, Charles.
And good evening, John. How are you doing?
Brought my son along here and helped me out tonight.
Well, I guess we'll get to it here. The publication of McNamara's book, In Retrospect, came about a year before The Living and the Dead. It set off renewed public conflict and controversy, almost as though we, Americans, were picking up where we left off 30 years earlier. Beginning in Living and the Dead, there's an unidentified man who's attempting to throw Robert McNamara overboard from a ferry between Woods Hole to Martha's Vineyard. Could you fill us in on that scenario?
Well, you actually said a lot of good things. Where do I start? Yes, first of all, to pick up on McNamara's book published in the spring of '95 called In Retrospect, I think that you're very right. What that did prove was the Vietnam War never went away. It was like malaria, just waiting under the surface of the skin to find its next new moment. And I think that McNamara woefully miscalculated. He thought he might get some kind of national forgiveness, and what he did was pull the pin on the new grenade. This book that I wrote took 12 years to write and was long in progress at the time that McNamara published his book. In fact, I like to think that everybody who's had anything to say about Vietnam or McNamara beat me to print. I was the last one out of the chutes. The way that I finally was able to solve the puzzle, the terrible riddle of this book, was not only to write about McNamara, Charles, but to put him in the center of the story, but to bring in, kind of like spokes to the hub of a wheel, 5 other stories of just ordinary Americans who led extraordinary lives, who got caught up in the war. And the one that you referred to is a kind of bookending story, functioning as a prologue and an epilogue. And this was an enraged, young 27-year-old artist in tennis shoes who, on a rainy Friday night in 1972, on a ferry boat crossing Vineyard Sound, which is 7 miles of open water, dark water, went up to Robert McNamara in the lunchroom of this ferry boat, a room as brightly lit as the one we're in, and said, "Excuse me, sir, you have a phone call, please follow me." And McNamara, for all his cunning, there is a great quotient of naivete. He set down his drink on the metal counter, he followed this man outside, the man wordlessly turned and got him by the throat and the belt buckle. And for the next 35 seconds, there was this kind of titanic struggle at the rail of that ship. If he would have gone over, he would have been sucked under the boat and would have died instantly. People from the crew ran out and pulled him back. I feel that 30 seconds of struggle at the railing between this icon figure of the war, who represents all this authority, all this power, and this disenfranchised 27-year-old artist who was kind of a shirker within the confines of his own family, who was regarded as a shirker because he evaded the war. That is the Vietnam War. What is it? It's the struggle between immense authority and kind of 60s rebellion right there at the rail. So I start the book and I close the book with that segment, and then there are other lives who come into the story.
Thank you. In reading the book, I was impressed with one small segment in the McNamara section, the early McNamara section, where he's seen as a graduate student in his little apartment, his young married life in Cambridge, and he's doing his dishes in the bathtub. It's a very human sort of scene, and a scene I think we can all identify with. And we have that picture of McNamara, and then I ask myself, well, how do we get from there with Robert McNamara to Robert McNamara misrepresenting the facts to the American public?
Which is a
with
nice way of
the experience
saying it,
totally
yeah.
going to hell.
Misrepresenting the facts, another way of saying it is lying, bold lying. I love this question. I must say that in the course of this book coming out, and it's been out now 7 months, and I've done a lot of television around the country and radio, national television, etc. Nobody has asked that particular question, or nobody remembers that particular detail of a graduate student at Harvard washing dishes in the sink because he's impecunious. He's making just a few dollars a week, and he's a graduate assistant at Harvard. How do we get from there to this man who can, well, I think that's the story of power corrupting, and people believe finally that they have this duty to this abstraction we call the state, and under that duty they can lie, they can manipulate the truth, they think they're better, they think they know better, they think they know better than the people who are fighting the war in the field, better than the ordinary Americans. I guess maybe at the root of your question is the fact that maybe McNamara lost touch with who he really was. If you look at the early Robert McNamara, it's a pretty decent, striving, earnest, even idealistic young man who comes out of Cal Berkeley in the 30s. At the tag end of the Depression, wants to do something good with his life, wants to do something good for America. He rises in the Ford Motor Company, and he gets recruited to Kennedy and Camelot, and then the story takes its curve.
You, I think, single out McNamara as the architect of the war for a particular opprobrium. Other people aren't mentioned so often, although they're not the subjects of the biography. Lyndon Johnson, Westmoreland, later Nixon,
Dean
Kissinger,
Rusk.
Dean Rusk. They had, all of them, I believe, the same opportunities as McNamara for impacting our history, for changing the course of events, and yet none of them did so.
Well, that's a very fair question. I think that McNamara, for some reason, stands as the absolute embodiment of this war. To a certain generation of Americans, yours and mine, you can say that name and it's like a knife point of visceral emotions. You can't say the name Dean Rusk and so instantly summon that kind of rage. Nixon and Kissinger when the war went on into the 70s and the secret bombing of Cambodia. But McNamara was there as the archetypal planner. He built it up. He was the architect of all the escalation. He was not the President of the United States, but he was enacting and designing the plans from 65 to 68 when we found, I think, in this country, our own Civil War. You know, if I can say something about my own Civil War and my own quagmire in this book, I worked on this book for 12 years, and one of the reasons I wanted to bring my son John to the show tonight was because when I started it up again the second time, John was very small. John is now about to celebrate his 9th birthday. I would come home at night so spiritually broken down, so physically exhausted, spiritually broken down. And if I didn't have my family members there to help me get through the rest of that evening and to get up the next morning and to face it again, I don't think I ever would have completed the book. And that's why I'm happy to have John here tonight.
You know, as we should also mention, although the principal subject is McNamara, there are the others. We've mentioned the artist on the ferry, but there are 4 other tales that are just searing. Corporal Farley, Norman Morrison, Marianne Cramell, Tron Van Tine.
We don't have time to mention them all, and I appreciate that you can recite their names. Norman Morrison, some people in Tacoma Park might recall that name. He was a pacifist Quaker who immolated himself below McNamara's window on a darkening eve in November '65. An incomprehensible act made all the more so because his one-year-old baby daughter, Emily, was with him in his presence. He either set her down before he lit the match or he dropped her after he started burning. We don't have a videotape. We don't know for sure. I tracked down all the eyewitnesses and all the accounts vary. But that is such a strange and powerful story, the burning of Norman Morrison. He was a Quaker who felt morally called, morally summoned to try to put some kind of stop to this war. He's one of the lives. You see, if McNamara strides every page of the story, these lives help me get the kind of connective tissue, the human tissue of the story.
Speaking of the human tissue and the connected tissue of the story, I mentioned the word synchronicity, Jungian concept. In The Living and Dead, it has an unusual structure for a biography or for a history. The scenarios shift rapidly. The book moves backward and forward in times. The lives of subjects are linked to McNamara in ongoing ways. Does the structure of the book suggest that there is a meaningful connection in history?
Well, boy, your questions are searching, and they don't seem to me television questions. They're questions that we need to have 2 hours to answer. I guess if I were giving a quick, very inadequate answer, I would say yes. I have been haunted for years by the idea of synchronicity. Synchronicity it's a Jungian principle, and it has to do with simultaneous events happening, and Jung saw these events happening on the same order of causality. They cannot be explained. Let me just give you a very quick example that'll take 10 seconds. Why is it that when Norman Morrison set himself on fire, Robert McNamara behind the wall was starting to grow with terrible doubt? And what is the interrelationship between those two events? Norman Morrison, when he burned himself in front of McNamara, didn't know that McNamara was growing with secret doubt. That's a synchronicity.
It is. We need to ask, when's the paperback?
The paperback, the vintage paperback is coming out in September. The English paperback is coming out in late August, and the Australian paperback is coming out in the summer. And we hope to get that darn movie option signed finally,
yes,
which has been hanging over.
We wish you all success in that as well as with the paperback edition. I want to mention that not just The Living and the Dead is available currently, but Paul's earlier book, Looking for the Light, The Hidden Life and Art of Marion Post Walcott, is available in a remainder edition currently, and we hope to have a paperback reprint sometime in the near future from one of the university presses,
Yes,
I believe.
yes, and Charles, I would like to say that Chuck and Dave's is a resource for Tacoma Park that is never appreciated enough. If I wasn't able to go into that store every day when I was writing the book, that's another, along with my family, that was another thing that got me through.
Thank you, Paul.
Next up in the Coffee House, poetry by Norman Green, followed by Coffee House Forum. Socially Responsible Investing with Elisa Gravitz of Co-op America and Stephen Sheath of the Calvert Group.
My name is Norman Green. I'm artist in Tacoma Park. I do sculpture, painting, and sometimes poems. And these poems are from this show called Common Images of Black Males. This is one is called Father's Fear, or A Better Way to Kill, something that a lot of fathers are worried about as their sons and daughters grow up. A better way to kill. There's a better way to kill. Use a knife or stick, a club with nails, or a bullet that explodes at contact. Kill faster, make bigger holes, cut longer cuts, stop the heart, cease the brain, invent the best killing tool. Who will be the next victim? Who cares? Take him out. Put him under, waste him. No one will miss him, except maybe his mother or his father, his sister, his brother, kinfolks, friends, lovers, and everyone who cares. This one is called First Date. I'm ready for Freddie. I'm ready to show, to style, to just be plain cool, calm, and gentle man. I'm going to show her the town, show her off, show her the best, give her top treatment, the best in the West, top of the block. I'm going to give her a glimpse of her future with me. She will love being with me, just love being with me, I hope.
Hi, and welcome to Coffee House Forum. I'm Mark Cohen. If you're among the Main Street millions who thinks that Wall Street is a shark-infested cesspool of amoral corporate fat cats worshiping at the altar of the almighty dollar, hey, who am I to argue with you? There is, however, another side to high finance. Call it socially responsible investing. And two of its leading exponents are with us in the coffee house to talk about how you can do good and do well with your savings. Elisa Gravitz is the Executive Director of Co-op America and is Vice Chair of the Social Investment Forum. She's joined by Steve Sheath, Vice President of the Calvert Group, located in Bethesda and Chairman of the Social Investment Forum. Welcome to Tacoma Coffee House.
Thank you.
Appreciate your coming. I was looking through some materials that I think you probably prepared somewhat in collaboration, in preparation for this program, and was quite stunned to see the amount of money that large mutual funds that maybe many of us are invested in have in tobacco stock. Can you talk about that?
Well, sure. At any given point in time, the top 15 mutual funds have over $3 billion in tobacco funds. Now, you have to understand that mutual funds buy and sell every day, so you take a snapshot at a given point in time and find out that if you're a mutual fund owner of one of the major companies, one of the top 15, the Vanguards, the Fidelities of the world, you are making money from tobacco.
And how much money are we talking about?
In terms of how much you're making, or
How much is being invested by unsuspecting mutual fund investors?
Well, you know, that really depends on the fund and it depends on the investor. I think probably everybody in the country who has never thought about what they own in their mutual funds probably owns some tobacco. It's almost without a doubt. In fact, we recently did a survey. I think you probably saw some of that information this afternoon, in partnership with Yankelovich, major polling firm, and we determined that upwards of 2/3 of the American public who own mutual funds cannot name a single company inside the fund, not a single one. Now, at the same time, about the same number of people, well over 60%, say they care about tobacco and really don't want to own tobacco. So, there's a dilemma there. There's a real disconnect, very obviously.
Let's name some names. You started to mention some of the mutual funds that are heavily invested in tobacco. Let's go through some of the more prominent ones.
Well, for example, if you're in any index fund, except the social investing funds, we'll get to that in a minute, you own tobacco. For example, the Vanguard company has a couple of different index funds. The Vanguard 500 is very, very popular. That's going to have tobacco in it.
When you say tobacco, like Philip Morris or Liggett or RJR?
Exactly. But the except is the very important part, because if you care about being tobacco-free, there are a set of about 45 mutual funds who by policy do not buy tobacco. So if you're a mutual fund investor and you want to be in a mutual fund and you say, there's no way I want to make money from tobacco, you can choose one of these 45 mutual funds and you can be assured that by policy it's tobacco-free. Now, when I say by policy, that's very important, because as any good investor knows, that before you invest you should get a prospectus. And an ordinary prospectus from an ordinary mutual fund, the kind that probably invests in tobacco, is only going to tell you about their financial policies. That's very important. You need to know that as an investor. The social investing mutual funds are also going to tell you what their policies are about what kinds of companies they'll invest in. And they'll say right up front, we do not invest in tobacco. They'll tell you about their environmental policies. They'll tell you about what kind of companies they look for in terms of outstanding performers in terms of community. And then you know that you have both the financial criteria and the social and environmental values right there up front, and you can make a choice.
I think I'm sort of a pretty okay guy. I'm environmentally conscious, I think. But I realized upon going through your materials that I'm invested in some of the funds I think that you all would favor, but I'm also invested in, for instance, the Janus Fund recently, and unbeknownst to me, I guess I'm supporting major polluters. Is that right?
That is almost certainly correct. That's right. Again, when you're talking about tobacco, in some ways it's very easy because there's only 5 companies, and it's pretty easy to tell what business they're in. But with the environment and the issues that we all are beginning to care about more and more relative to the environment, relative to the impact on our drinking water and the air we breathe and waste management and that sort of thing, virtually every company in every industry has some impact, some of course much, much greater than others. The heavy metals, the chemical companies, the pulp and paper companies, those kinds of organizations, and even a lot of the defense and weapons contractors have tremendous environmental impact. And if you don't think about that, and if you don't do a little bit of homework or hook up with somebody who does the homework on these kinds of issues, you're almost certainly investing in companies that are degrading the environment.
Most people, though, are going to say that's all fine and good. If I had my druthers, I'd invest in something that was beneficial. On the other hand, I'm investing in order to make money, not in order to help other people. Is it the case that you're throwing good money after bad by investing in socially responsible mutual funds?
I don't think so at all. I think, in fact, you're throwing good money after good money. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where people can connect their values and their investment dollars, or their values and their consumer purchase decisions for that matter, by understanding who the company is behind the product that they're investing in. Now, there's a growing body of empirical evidence that would suggest that your preconceived notion of having to give something up to invest in a more responsible way is really just not true. The Domini Social Index, which is a mathematical model of 400 companies that have passed some of the most rigorous social criteria out there, has been live now since May of 1990. So it's over, I guess it's almost 7 years. And it has consistently outperformed the S&P 500, which is the big cap stock universe that most companies compare themselves to when they're comparing performance. In fact, since that, in that period of time, which is almost 7 years, the Domini Index has returned about 215%. Compared to the S&P 500, which is 190%. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot. The fact is that if we had been even on an even keel, I could refute the argument that you're making.
It sounds fine, but my own personal experience, I have to tell you, has not been quite as blessed by some of these mutual funds. Some of it's recent. I suppose that there are natural fluctuations in the marketplace. But what do you tell people when they say, well, look, I'm earning money in funds that maybe aren't high on your list of beneficial ones, but are preparing my bank account to get my kid through college?
Well, there's, back to what Steve was saying, there's no reason a smart investor can't do as well with social investing as with what we call conventional investing. Steve gave you one of the premier examples, the Domini Social Index. It's apples to the S&P 500. And that's very important.
Let's look at the Domini Social Index for just a second. What is it screening for? What is it saying is a socially responsible company investment?
You start with some very quick and basic avoidance criteria. We don't invest, the index does not invest in tobacco or alcohol or gambling companies. It does not invest in egregious polluters. It doesn't invest in companies that have a consistent pattern of discrimination and that sort of thing. It looks at workplace issues, employer-employee type issues. I mean, a lot of this is really quite commonsensical in the sense that if you have employer and employee that are not getting along, whether it's unionized or not, that's a company that's probably not going to do as well as one of its competitors where there's a good deal of synchronicity between the the two groups.
And then it takes the next step that social investors do. As Steve said, you start out with the avoidance. You get rid of the things that are really egregious. And then you start looking for the companies that are making a special contribution. Are they doing it through the kinds of long-lasting products that are contributing to the really the bottom line productivity of this country? Are they investing in their communities? Is it health? Is it education? So there's also this sense of what kind of companies are contributing to the good. The kind of thing where if we all sat down in a room and said, we are imagining a future, what kind of companies do we want in it? Those are the kinds you'd pick.
Who are some of these companies?
The outstanding ones?
Mm-hmm.
I think, why don't you give us some of those lists?
There's actually a lot. And,
Right.
and one of the misnomers is that by doing all this screening, you end up with small companies you've never heard of before, the tie-dye T-shirt manufacturers, those kinds of things. And that's not true. I mean, we own Fannie Mae, we own Hewlett-Packard, we own Morton, the salt company. Obviously, it's not just salt; it's a major chemical manufacturer. And we actually go one step further.
When you say we, we're talking about the Calvert Group now.
I'm talking about Calvert, but I'm also talking about the social investment industry.
Okay.
And I think it's certainly true for the Domini Social Index as well. They own these companies too.
And you're choosing these companies not simply because they screen out certain things like tobacco, but they engage in certain affirmative conduct that you favor.
Well, that's absolutely true, and I think what's really important here is to understand that there are no perfect companies out there. Nobody is perfect. In every case, we try to pick the best of the best, and then we actually try to work on improving them still more. It's a dialoguing process, which sometimes leads to shareholder resolutions and really trying to poke them in the ribs a little bit to behave in a little bit more responsible way, or to treat the environment, to treat their employees or their communities in a little more responsible way. It's really a process of looking for not only the traditional bottom line, the quantitative analysis of how much money can we make to achieve the investor's goals and objectives as let's say a retiree, but also to do so in a way that rewards and encourages the most positive corporate behavior, the kind of behavior that's going to help us create a better world to retire into.
Right. And let's get practical. Let's get back to that question you asked before, well, but what about me? If you want to be a social investor, there's really 3 ways you can do it. One is that you can invest in one of these mutual funds. There are 45 mutual funds. They have a whole range of objectives. You can get index funds, you can get growth funds, you can get bond funds, you can get international funds. There are a wide range of choices for people who want to be social investors. Secondly, you can turn to a financial planner who specializes in socially responsible investing. And thirdly, of course, you can do it yourself. What you would do is you would add to the research that you do for your financial concerns is that you would also look at your social and environmental concerns.
And Co-op America has developed a handbook, I understand, that helps people to do just that.
Absolutely. What we have for you, for all the listeners here, is a handbook that takes you through the investing process. What's your income? How much can you afford to save? How do you increase that saving even more so you can invest more? And then what kind of social and environmental criteria do you have? How do you find these investments? Then together with that, the Social Investment Forum has, that you can get in one nice little package, a directory of all the mutual funds, of all the financial planners in the country that are focusing on this. So you can get the professional help you want and need for your financial future and do both at the same time. You can have these financial returns for your family, and at the same time you can create the world you want your family to live in.
I think our viewers would probably be angry at me if I didn't at least try to get out of you some tips on socially responsible but lucrative investments that they might be able to make in mutual funds.
Well,
understanding that you're with the Calvert Group and you may have an axe to grind here.
Which fund really depends on who you are, what your goals are, how long you have to retirement, for example. I think it's pretty clear that if you're our age, you want to be fairly aggressive.
Speak for yourself.
You want to be fairly aggressive. I mean, if you've got 20 years, 25 years to retirement, you want to invest in a growth fund, a domestic equity growth fund or an international equity growth fund. Calvert has a very fine international fund. It's called the Calvert World Values International Equity Fund. It's done very well over the years. It's going to be 5 years old here in the next couple of months. It hits its 5-year birthday, and it's returned close to 10, 11, 12%. I'm not 100% sure on that one, since then. And it's a great place to diversify into, international. Everybody today should probably have somewhere between 10 and 25% of their portfolio invested overseas, because the market is so good, it's so strong, and it's so much bigger than the U.S. market.
Isn't it more difficult to feel confident that you're socially responsibly investing overseas
Well,
than
that's certainly
domestically?
the case if you're trying to do it yourself. But if you're investing with Calvert, where we take care of those kinds of issues for you, where we do all the research. Yes, it's more difficult research, the information is more difficult to come by, but we can assure you that you'll be investing in a way that's much more true to your values.
All right, quickly, how do we get in touch with the Calvert Group if we're interested?
Well, we're in Bethesda, 800-368-2748.
And Co-op America?
We're here at Washington, D.C. You can call us at 800-58-GREEN, or the local number is 202-872-5307. Say that you heard about us on the show, and we can get one of those directories out to you.
Great. And you're both associated with something called the First Affirmative Financial Network, I gather, which in its statement of purpose under a series of we believe statements, I think might sum up, we believe that most thoughtful people are unwilling to profit from behavior in others that they would find unacceptable in themselves, and would hesitate to accept profits without respect to values. I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. Hopefully this brief conversation is giving you folks at home some ideas about how to put your investment dollar to work for a better future for you and for the rest of us. Thanks again to Elisa Gravitz and Steve Sheath for joining us in the coffee house. So till next time, and even thereafter, I'm Mark Cohen for Tacoma Coffee House.